Good morning.
Good morning.
Grace and peace and mercy are yours from God who is love. During the process of becoming a pastor, going through seminary and the call process and other pieces of formation, there's a year-long internship. The process is actually really exciting. We get assigned to a congregation, and then we get to spend a whole year practicing how to be a pastor with the help of a supervisor and a congregation that's willing to teach. I was assigned to an ecumenical congregation in Virginia for my pastoral internship, and so we packed up our bags, loaded the U-Haul, and made our way there. It was August of 2020. Lucky me, right? Internship in the beginning stages of a global pandemic. But truly it was a really awesome opportunity for learning. To see and to be a part of the response of the church as the world spiraled into this new sense of divisiveness over how to handle the pandemic. One side was so certain that forsaking pews for screens was a betrayal of the sacred, and the other convinced that gathering in person, regardless of precautions, would be a reckless endangerment of life itself. And in that season of vital transformation, adaptation, and the question, where is God leading the church? I stepped into my new role as pastoral intern. There I quickly learned that each far side tended to see the other not just as mistaken, but as dangerous, wrong, possibly even evil. Good intentions shadowed by fear, and fear hardened into judgment. I'll never forget the day that we moved into our apartment for internship. Jonathan and I had just gotten married earlier in the year. Yes, not only did I get to enjoy internship during pandemic, we also got to change our wedding plans in 2 weeks. But we made it. And so we were just moving into our apartment when our next door neighbor walked out, and she started a conversation with me. She pointed to a bumper sticker on my car that she misunderstood, assuming that my political views aligned with hers. And she opened the conversation with that. And when I said, "Oh, I actually don't support that candidate," she quickly responded, "Well, you can't be a Christian and not vote for so-and-so. What about insert hot political topic here?" I smiled at her and I started to respond. I said, "I just don't think it's that black and white, you know." No, she interrupted me, and she walked into her house. That was it, the entire introduction. I didn't know her name. I didn't know anything about her family or her roots or hobbies she enjoyed, simply that we disagreed on politics, and that meant the conversation was over. Unfortunately, I think since then, the political division that we were facing at the time has not really gotten any better. Maybe it's gotten worse even. And maybe, just maybe, that leads us to want to ask the same question that the expert of the law asks Jesus in our gospel passage today. So you want me to love my neighbor? Who exactly is my neighbor? And Jesus responds with a story, as Jesus does, the story of the Good Samaritan. And it's likely that if you grew up going to church, this story's probably really familiar to you. But even if you didn't grow up going to church, it's really likely you've heard the term Good Samaritan. In fact, it's so ingrained into our culture that sometimes it feels like just a compliment to call someone a Samaritan. And maybe we forget then that in Jesus' time and context, it was not a compliment. The story has a huge twist, a big shock factor, and sometimes that gets lost when we hear it for maybe like the 20th time, or we don't fully understand the big wow. You see, in Jesus' time, the Samaritan was not the same connotation. To the Jews, the Samaritans were the other, the wrong, the enemy, the neighbor who lives next door in proximity but is an entirely different world when it comes to views and what we find important. The Samaritans were a mixed race. They were half Jew, half Gentile. And to the Jews, even though they worshiped Yahweh as well, they were way worse than the Gentiles because they defiled the religion. They were just wrong, and they were truly just not to be associated with. And so when this pious Jewish man, this actual expert of the law, asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" it's a really big deal that Jesus tells this story. Because this story flips the script. It takes the audience by surprise. It causes man-made barriers to simply come crashing down. The story is bold, it's surprising, it's a shocking realization of what it means to love your neighbor. The story starts with tragedy. A man is robbed, stripped, beaten, left for dead. And we see two men pass right by. But they're not simply just random men walking by, right? Jesus tells us they're both named as religious figures in Jewish society. A Levite and a priest. They see the man and they walk to the other side of the road. And we notice that no excuse is given for why they simply pass by. But if we were to think about it, about why they might not stop, we could probably come up with a few. First of all, to touch someone who was dead in their culture was considered very ritually unclean. And so if they didn't know whether or not this man was dead, why risk becoming unclean? Or maybe they were on their way to do some important church business, something that just couldn't wait. Either way, no excuse takes away the fact that they crossed to the other side of the road, don't acknowledge the man, and pass right by. And how often do we let things like religion or our own ideas of cleanliness and worthiness and freaking rules stand in our way of loving the neighbor? As Jesus commands and says clearly, this is the greatest rule of all. But how often do we decide that other rules are actually more important? And then comes the Samaritan, the impure other, likely a shocker, probably actually really annoying to the expert of the law. But we have this unexpected bearer of compassion and care. Who knows where he was going or what he needed to do that day? Whatever it was could wait, because there was a neighbor in need. And I think it's very important to note that he didn't ask the neighbor, "Hey man, what'd you do to get yourself inside that ditch?" Or, "Hey, what are you going to do to avoid this mistake in the future if I help you?" Or, "What's your religion, your ethnicity, your political affiliation, your citizenship?" No, he simply helped a neighbor in need. I am pleased to share that the story with my own neighbor on internship did not end with no, and a slammed door. But actually it did develop into a relationship. A relationship where we knew that we disagreed on some things, some big things, and somehow we found ways to learn from one another. And what I learned from this neighbor is what I continue to learn now, that when we fail to see the humanity in others, that's when we lose the whole point. When we crack jokes behind online masks about someone else's tragedy, but it's okay because someone falls into this box or that box, and maybe that person deserves what they got. Or maybe they could work harder or smarter to avoid it in the future. When we start to see people as a caricature of who they are, when we put them in boxes based on their political ideologies that we disagree with, their legal status, their ideas of how to best handle a pandemic, their race or gender or ethnicity or who they love or their beliefs that might differ wildly from our own. But Jesus flips the script. Jesus comes in and he intentionally disrupts the boundaries that humans have created, disrupting our beliefs that we can use rules to determine who's worthy of the title neighbor. And so I want you to close your eyes and think about something for a minute. If you were the person in the ditch, If you found yourself in great need of help, whose hand is the one you would least like to see reaching toward you to help? That's your neighbor. We're reminded by Jesus himself that we are called to be a neighbor too, to see the humanity not just in the person that we find in the ditch, but also in the unlikely helper, and the hand that we would rather just swat away. The humanity of the person that we have placed inside of a box because it's easier that way. So let us not ask the question, who is our neighbor? Not to question who really matters, because the answer is always going to be the same to God, right? Everybody. And instead, may we ask, how can we be neighbors? The question that Jesus ends up answering anyway. How can we be neighbors to those it comes easily to help and to those it does not? How can we seek to see the humanity in every single person that we encounter and to truly love our neighbor as ourselves? It might not be easy, but we don't have to do it alone. And Jesus said, go and do likewise. Amen.